Hi everyone, and welcome back. We are joined again by Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi, professor at Tehran University and also a former advisor to Iran's nuclear negotiation team. So welcome back to the program.
Hi, Glenn. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure.
So we now had this decapitation strike on Yemen. We also had some more attacks on Lebanon despite the ceasefire, and many are now suspecting that another attack on Iran might be coming. Indeed, the last attack didn't really end with a peace, but rather the need for a halt in the hostilities. So many are interpreting this simply as a temporary ceasefire for good reasons and that new hostilities are coming. I was wondering, though, how you assess the situation. Do you see another war coming in the foreseeable future? That is between US, Israel, and Iran.
Yes, I think it's quite possible. The Iranians are preparing themselves. The Israeli regime and the West is preparing the Israeli regime. So they're working together. Iran is basically on its own, but it is preparing itself. Iran has an advantage in that last time around, the Israeli regime gave it everything it had. It was a sort of, as they like to call it, regime change operation that was supported by the collective West, the United States in particular. So they use all of their capabilities. Iran, on the other hand, it was a on the first day it was caught off guard. It knew that an attack was coming, but the scope of the attack, I think, they miscalculated. So it was an intelligence failure without a doubt. But the military victory of Iran over the Israelis, despite the intelligence failure, I think shows that Iran, under difficult circumstances, when it was, basically it confronted a blitzkrieg attack that killed so many of its senior commanders and destroyed uh, installations on day one. Despite all that, the fact that it was able to regroup and force the Israelis to seek a ceasefire shows that Iran has an advantage now, because while the Israelis used everything that they had at their disposal, the Iranians didn't do that. Some of the newer missiles uh, were the newer models, they were left untouched. And we have an even newer model now, a newer missile that has been added to Iran's missile defense force or missile offense force. And we all know that none of the underground missile bases were even used during the first war. And Iran right now is busy trying to deal with the mistakes that it made, the shortcomings that it had, both intelligence and military. So I think Iran definitely has a much greater advantage as time progresses than the Israelis. Uh, but sometimes people say, then why does the Israeli regime want to launch another attack? And I think it really is more about Netanyahu and his coalition and their own selfish interests that are more important than the interests of the regime for them. So Netanyahu and his coalition, the war that they launched on Lebanon, the continued genocide in Gaza, the attacks on Yemen, and the war against Iran, all of these are about Netanyahu and the coalition rather than the interests of the Israeli regime itself. So another war against Iran, I think, would be uh, a failure for the regime. It would probably be a bigger failure for the regime than the first war. But he's not looking out for the interests of Zionism. He's looking out for the interests of Netanyahu.
Well, it seems in preparation for a possible coming war, that Iran is also reported to is being improving its missile capabilities, not just the quantity but the quality as well. And well, across the media though, over the past 24 to 48 hours, there's been a lot of reporting on Iran's, they call it the end of time missile. I'm not sure if that's the correct translation. I was wondering if you can, what do we actually know about these weapons, and what will be the actual impact on the battlefield or in terms of deterrence?
I don't know much about the details. I know that it has a very heavy payload. Um, what we saw during the 12-day war was that progressively the percentage of Iranian missiles that were downed by the regime and the Americans and the Europeans and this coalition of countries, which includes regional countries, uh, radar installations from Turkey to installations across the Persian Gulf were used. The airspace of Jordan was used. The airspace of Iraq was used, even though Iraq was opposed to it, but they couldn't do anything about it. So this huge coalition, they were working to block Iran's missile attacks. But during the last few days, 90% of Iranian missiles got through. And I think that shows that the more advanced Iranian missiles are better equipped to pass through the multi-layered defenses that these countries collaborated to put together. And as I said, some of Iran's missiles have never been used. Now, some of these missiles, I think they have different missiles, both to make it more difficult for the enemy to down them, but also they serve different purposes. Some of them have warheads that break up into smaller warheads. Some of them have a bigger payload. Some of them are very precision. They strike the target precisely. Some are not as precise, especially the older missiles, but they can be used for big targets that where you don't need great precision. There are lots of calculations which I obviously don't understand because I'm not an expert on these things and I'm not privy to the information anyway. But the point is that the the Israeli regime was running out and the Americans, they were running out of missile defense systems. And the Iranians have a lot more missiles that they haven't used. The overwhelming bulk of Iran's missiles that have been prepared for the Israeli regime in particular, they're still in place and they're building more of them. The missiles that Iran and the other underground bases that Iran has developed to the Persian Gulf have not been touched. Even when the Iranians fired 12 missiles at Qatar, at the American base, where 6 struck their targets, especially destroying a key radar installation there, those 12 missiles were not the medium and short range missiles that are prepared for the Persian Gulf and the um, uh, the the Indian Ocean and the Sea of Oman. Uh, those those are prepared. Those are also being upgraded as we speak in case the Americans seek to get involved. And as I've discussed earlier, if the Americans get involved, the Iranians have the capability to destroy everything in the Persian Gulf, all oil and gas assets and ships and tankers, as well as installations that take oil to the Red Sea or to alternative ports for exports. So the Iranians are preparing both for the Israeli regime and for the Americans. They're upgrading their systems, even though the systems that they have, as we saw, were quite effective against the Israelis.
How might the second round of this war look different than the first, though? Because in the first one, we saw Israel go after the political and military leadership in Iran. We saw the jamming of air defenses in Iran. We saw their drones having been smuggled inside Iran to launch strikes from within. Um, Do you think it's more likely that Israel will they lean more on proxies like Syria or even through cooperation with Azerbaijan? And but also, how will Iran fight differently? You think in a round two, which God forbid won't happen, but it looks more and more likely.
In round two, Iran will obviously be in a much stronger position because the Israeli regime used everything at its disposal. All of its assets inside Iran were used, and most of them have been arrested. Um, their their Iranian weaknesses are being studied. So Iran is going to be more careful about protecting its officials, more careful about protecting its anti aircraft and anti drone systems. We have to keep in mind, by the way, that no Israeli aircraft entered Iranian airspace during the 12 days. They launched their missiles from uh, Iraq, and they flew over Syria and Jordan, and in Iraq they fired their missiles. Though the drones that they launched came to Iran, so it was missiles and drones that were hitting targets in Iran, and many of those drones came from neighboring countries. Some all the way from Syria, some from northern Iraq, and there are strong accusations made that many also came from the Republic of Azerbaijan. But also when it comes to northern Iraq and the Republic of Azerbaijan, I think it's going to be more difficult for the Israeli regime next time round. As you know, Aliyev in Baku is he has also antagonized Russia, and Russia has bombed his assets in Ukraine and arrested many people in Russia who are somehow more or less affiliated to Aliyev. But in Iraqi Kurdistan also, the Iranians and their allies have discovered many of those places and people who are involved in firing drones. So it's going to be a lot more difficult for the Israeli regime next time around. The Iranians, of course, they will they have a long way to go to be fully prepared. They're going to make some short-term adjustments, medium-term adjustments, and long-term adjustments. And right now, I think those short-term adjustments and changes are the focus for the weeks or months ahead.
So yeah, just as a summary on this, you expect Iran to have less restraints in terms of both the kind of missiles and the targeting in the next war?
Yes, I think that Iran's defenses will be better because Iran is looking at all its shortcomings and what sort of uh, offensive capabilities the Israeli regime has and how it was used and how, therefore, to adjust to be able to better protect itself against these capabilities. But on the other hand, I think the Iranians are going to hit much harder, and they're going to be very swift. It's going to be very bad for the Israeli regime. And as I said, Iran is also preparing itself in the Persian Gulf region as well. Um, Iran's assets across the Persian Gulf have been increased, and Iran's capabilities to defend itself against drones and aircrafts are also increasing too.
And well, there's more, I guess, news around Iran these days. That is, the European Union, well, a few hours ago reported that they have now begun the process of reimposing the snapback sanctions. One can ask what led to this decision. I'm guessing they got a call from Washington, or they perhaps they have their own reasons. But yeah, so please correct me on this. But what the EU is also demanding, though, one of the things is full cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, that is the IAEA. And I was wondering, what is the thinking about this within Iran in terms of both the the relationship. I'm not sure if yes, diplomacy with the European Union, but also the relationship that Iran can actually have with the IAEA, given I think it's not a secret anymore that the IAEA was handing over a lot of information to the Americans and the Israelis, which were used in targeting Iran. So it does seem to put Iran in a bit of a dilemma. I was just wondering, again, what is the thinking about this within Iran? What do you expect? How do you expect Iran to react to this, well, threats or pressures coming from the European Union?
When the JCPOA was first signed in 2015, I was there. I was in Vienna. I was a media advisor, just like I was 3, 4 years ago with Dr. Balgari when he was negotiating in Vienna. And on the day when it was being signed, I told Dr. Zarif that didn't believe that the Americans were going to abide by their commitments. And based on my understanding, I said that the United States sees itself as exceptional. The Europeans, of course, see themselves as exceptional and, Eurocentric. They see the world as a Eurocentric world. And so they will not commit themselves the way in which you may hope. And that, of course, includes the snapback provisions. Um, I believe from the beginning that we would never see this 10 years go by without the snapback being used. Um, there are lots. There's a lot to say here. I think it actually brings a lot of clarity, and it's the last 2 years has been very important to unite Iranians. Many young Iranians who always thought the West uh, was, you know, especially upper middle class young Iranians, they did not see the revolution. They didn't see the Shah, his brutality. They didn't know much about the war, the West giving Saddam chemical weapons, and they were young, and many of them thought that the problem really lied with Iran, that Iran was stuck in history, and that its hatred for the West was irrational, and that Iran was obsessed with the West, and that's why we can't solve our problems. In fact, when Mahsa Amini passed away, it became pretty clear soon that she wasn't murdered or that she wasn't beaten, because the footage came out, and then we saw her father give an interview where he basically admitted that she had a major operation on her brain beforehand, and there was the autopsy and so on. But the reason why the riots continued was about something much bigger, because many young Iranians, university students, thought it's Iran's fault. If Iran just compromised, the problems with the West would be solved. The war in Gaza changed that a lot. Gradually, that segment of society, which wasn't a majority, but it was a substantial segment of society, especially among the youth. But also the 12-day war was a sea change, because these young people saw that as Iran was negotiating, the United States was deceiving Iran. And it was not just Trump. We saw the collective West, the Europeans, those who opposed Trump, in the media, CNN, all of them working against Iran. CNN was talking about sleeper cells in the United States and demonizing Iranian Americans in order to help antagonize Iran and justify aggression and war and death and destruction and the support of the Israeli regime. So young Iranians saw this. The JCPOA is another example. A lot of young Iranians thought that if we just sign a deal with the West, and back then, those Iranians are older now, if we just sign a deal with the West, everything would be solved, and we'd be living in a wonderful world where we could have growth and peace and so on. But what the Europeans are doing now is teaching these people the harsh reality of the Western Empire. And that is that it was Iran that from day one abided by its commitments. And it was Americans and Europeans that were under Obama violating the deal. Then under Trump, they tore up the deal, and the Europeans halted all of their commitments. They were in non-compliance. There was non-performance on the European side. Whereas the Iranians continued to abide by all of their commitments for a full year after the West left. And then in year two, the Iranians, in 5 stages every 2 months, decreased their commitments to put pressure on the West to come back to the deal. And then, so they didn't. And after 2 years, Iran went back to before the nuclear deal. And now the Europeans, after supporting the airstrikes on Iran, after supporting the airstrikes on Iran's nuclear installations, and after the International Atomic Energy Agency lied to justify the attacks and then refused to condemn the attacks, people are now much more realistic. And the fact is that now that the Europeans are seeking the snapback mechanism, ordinary Iranians see that they see the hypocrisy of the Europeans as they should. And to be very blunt, the return to the revival of the UN Security Council resolutions won't have any impact on the Iranian economy. They will only have a psychological impact for a couple of months, because there's a lot of psychological warfare being deployed against the Iranians right now in the Persian media that's broadcast in the West, funded by Western governments. NED and USAID, they may be shut down, but the money that goes to anti-Iranian activities is very much in place. So they're trying to create fear among Iranians, and they will have some effect without a doubt for the next few weeks, and then until a few weeks after the snapback has taken place. But it's not going to have any real effect, because those sanctions, all those things that are sanctioned in those UN Security Council resolutions, they're limited, and they're all covered, and much more is covered by the American maximum pressure sanctions. There's nothing new in them that's going to be added, and they're limited to the nuclear program and the military. Iran's military is largely self-sufficient. Its nuclear program is completely self-sufficient. And the Russians and the Chinese have already stated that they don't see what the West is doing as legitimate for 2 reasons. One is what I explained before, that Iran was in compliance and the West was not. And so they don't have the moral right to use this mechanism. The second was that the Europeans, they did not use the dispute mechanism. So they swiftly went to this 30-day period, and this, so they don't have the legal right nor the moral right, and that is something that the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese have said. So I don't see it as having an impact, a significant impact on Iran in the long term at all. In the short term, yes, it will have some effect on the markets, but I think the biggest loser by far is the Europeans, because the Iranians have no more reason to negotiate with the Europeans in future. And the Europeans have burned their bridges everywhere, with the Russians, with the Chinese, with Iran, and their support for this Holocaust in Gaza. All of these combined have made Europe irrelevant to us. And so after the JCPOA comes to its end, we will not be talking to the Europeans anymore. They will just be ordinary countries out there that are not our priority, and there's no need for them to be our priority. Do they have industry? Do they have important products that we seek? No. Everything that we need comes from Asia, from Latin America, and from Africa. The BRICS right now, the Iranian president is landing in China, and he will be meeting with the leaders of China, Russia, India, among others. And the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, these are the organizations that have member states that have what Iran needs. And Europe, which is rapidly declining. During the nuclear negotiations, when I told when I was in Vienna, I told the Europeans and their elites who'd speak with me and the journalists who'd come to see me in Vienna that a harsh winter is coming for Europe. You've started, you have a war with Russia, you've imposed sanctions. You need Iran. You need Iran's oil, you need Iran's gas. You can invest in Iran and you can invest in Iran's energy sector and solve some of your problems, many of your problems. But they didn't care, just as they didn't care about what the effect the sanctions had uh, f- on Russia on their own economies. They didn't care. They ultimately, when the Americans blocked the deal, because we had a deal, and then after we had the riots in Iran, the Europeans and Americans changed their calculations, and they thought that they would be able to get more concessions from Iran, and that failed too. But now the Europeans, they have nothing. They've burned their bridges with Russia, Iran, China, and so on. We saw how the trade agreement between the EU and the United States went. We also saw how the seven European leaders, how they sat in front of Trump. Europe has no weight. It carries no weight for Iran. It's on the decline. And so Iran's priority is going to go elsewhere. And now that the Europeans are tearing up the JCPOA, that was the last thread that gave them some sort of special status with Iran. That's finished.
Yeah, I've written a few books on the Russia's all greater Eurasian strategy, and I always make that point that it's not a strategy for or against the West. It's a strategy for a geoeconomic strategy making making the West matter less. That is, whatever Europe does, it shouldn't affect them too much. This is the general idea, which can be either good or bad for the Europeans. One shouldn't always overestimate that as a good thing. Countries depend too much on them. But of course, they are declining in relevance. This but this enduring Eurocentrism, even after the world becomes more multipolar, I always argue is very, very harmful, because whenever I talk to Chinese diplomats, ambassadors or something, they always say the same thing. That is, that the Europeans, they come to them and try to lecture them instead. And even now, even India, which is supposed to be, we imagine it's our best friend in the region. There's even threats against them, and this belittling, telling them what kind of foreign policy they should have, who they can trade with. These threats now, not just from the United States, but now also coming from the Europeans of doing secondary sanctions. And it's, I mean, I always argue that we should try to rediscover diplomacy instead, and which includes recognizing the concerns of others, and not seeing diplomacy as being between this teacher and the student, in which it's spoken in the language of ultimatums and threats always. But I always get the same response if I make this argument that, well, why are you taking their side? But my whole point is that this is not in our interest, that is in the Europeans' interest. This is self-harm. When there's a multipolar world, this threatening behavior doesn't work in our advantage. All it does is incentivizing countries to decouple and reduce dependence. And this is effectively what I see happening, a new world being created now without the Europeans, where the Europeans are betting everything on America. And if America even wants to see the Europeans as they're rushing to Asia, they make them sit like schoolboys. I mean, it's so self-destructive, yet we don't accept any dissent here. There's no recognition that perhaps pretending the world is Eurocentric when it's actually multipolar, this failure to recognize reality as it is very destructing. And again, I see much of the world becoming openly resentful. Even an EU member, I was invited recently by an ambassador in this country from a Central European EU member who, she was making the point that, the ambassador, that whenever they meet with business representatives or anyone from the country, they always want to tell them how to run their country, what kind of gender policies they should have, what kind of political reforms they should have. And it's it is just strange, because they would never occur to them to do the opposite. You have business tie and you try to lecture, but again, this pressure tactics, I think it is isolating and weakening the Europeans. And yeah, my fear is that they will wake up too late, because none of these things being done is good for the continent. And indeed, I think the continent would prosper from nurturing better relationship with a lot of countries, not just China, India, Russia, but also Iran as well, with the energy issues, as you suggested. Just my last question, though, because a lot of the tensions now between the West and Iran, as you have argued, is not really only about this nuclear program. If it was about the nuclear program only, we would have isolated this to a separate topic, but it's always linked to the ballistic missile program, which is Iran's deterrence. It's the foreign partnerships of Iran, like why are the Iranians working with Yemen, Hezbollah, Hamas? So a lot of this is tied to Gaza and the destruction of Gaza. So I was just wondering, how severe is the situation now in terms of not just the destruction by military force, but also the starvation? Is this reaching a critical stage where there would be, or have we reached a critical stage in terms of deaths spiraling out of control?
Well, first, I'd like to or repeat something that you said, which I thought was very significant, and that is that when you uh, speak to people of influence in the West and tell them about what they're doing wrong, and they say, "Why are you supporting the other side?" That shows uh, that the myth of Western rationality is really a myth, because for centuries we've been told, uh, in the Orientalist thinking, that the West is rational, that the West is reasonable, and the rest of the world is irrational and emotional, and that's what makes the West more mature. And the truth, though, is, I think, really the opposite. In the case that when they speak about why are you supporting them, all you're doing is pointing out their irrational behavior. And for this person and for people like this person, what is important is not rational decision making, but it is for you to remain on their team, for you to be obedient, and to, it's like being a supporter of a football team. You support that football team regardless of who's playing for the team, regardless of who owns the team. It's just the color of the jersey that's important. Sometimes in these football teams, a player from a rival team who was hated till yesterday, he joins the club and now he becomes a hero. That is not, in football, that may be fine, but in the real world, that is highly destructive, that sort of mentality. And this is the mentality of Europe and the United States. And that is highly dangerous, because the Europeans are making decisions based on their emotions. And I'm speaking, of course, about European elites. I'm not talking about the general population. People across the world and in the West, they're waking up. The massive protests that we've seen in Australia in the last couple of weeks show that in the West, just like everywhere else in the world, when people get information, despite the censorship and despite the algorithms and all that, when they get the information, they take a moral stance. It doesn't matter where they are in the world. And that, for me, is the most encouraging thing of all. But in any case, and people from all religions, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, young Hindus, or um, people from different races, it doesn't matter. When they see the reality, the majority, they know where they have to stand. But these decision makers, uh, they don't take their decisions based on morality, or on rationality and morality as well. So I've had a lot of experiences with Western diplomats in Iran who come to visit me, sometimes ambassadors, sometimes the first secretary, sometimes MPs who travel to Iran from Europe and the United States, and they always begin lecturing. And then when I push back, uh, they they don't take it well, and I won't say which country, but once an ambassador, uh, when I responded, this was a few years ago, before Gaza, and I said that he was talking about human rights and how Iran has to change, and I was I was talking about Palestine and their support for Saddam Hussein, giving him chemical weapons, and he got so he openly said, "Look, we are superior, we are better than everyone else, and I will not tolerate this." And we were having a calm conversation, and there was a group of us, and he just got up and left, like a very important European ambassador. He's no longer in Iran. This was like if this was before Corona. But that mentality where they feel that they can lecture the rest of the world and they don't care about reason and rationality, the assumption, they assume their own moral and civilizational superiority is what's destroying them. So they can lecture everyone and pretend that they have the moral higher ground, but the rest of the world is looking at Gaza and forget everything else. But the world is looking at Gaza, and no one is going to accept Western lectures on any issue anymore. But these people, these leaders, these elites in the West continue to live in their bubble. And because of that, it's going to get progressively, progressively worse. So what was your question? I'm sorry. I should have.
No, no, it was no. Well, I was asking about the crisis now, but playing out in Gaza. But if just a quick comment, though, I often make this point as well with the Germans. That is, if you see what's in the German security interest, it would not be to redivide and remilitarize the continent. Perhaps not placing these new missiles next year from the Americans. Maybe it's not leading a proxy war in Ukraine. It's not in their security. But if you comment on it, then, well, that's pro-Russian. And also the economy. If you want the German economy to thrive, you need to connect with the Russian economy. But they can't do any of these things. It's in their national interest, but it's considered to be pro-Russian. So they're inhibited from doing it. So I do think it's a rationality issue that it's if you're cheering for our team, then you have to be against them. Like I heard a comment many times. Well, that's what Putin would want us to do. And it's like, well, maybe sometimes not always going against the largest country in Europe is perhaps a good thing for Europe. But anyways, I digress. My question was about the destruction and starvation in Gaza. How critical point are we at that moment?
Yeah, and exactly, you're right. I mean, when they say that, well, that's that would be doing what Putin wants. That's irrational. It's not important if A wants something or not. You look and see what's the right thing to do, and you do it. Whether President Putin or Trump or anyone else likes it or dislikes it, you have to make a rational decision. But this sort of mentality it shows the degree of irrationality that dominates European and Western decision making processes. With regards to Gaza, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that the Israelis are not winning on at two levels. One is in the eyes of the world. The Israeli regime uh, has become increasingly diminished in the eyes of people across the world for almost 2 years now. But ever since we've seen images of starving kids and starving people, there has been a much more rapid decline in the fortunes of the regime. And we now see officials in Europe and the United States and public figures taking a position, not because they are moral people. No, it's simply because they see the population in their countries, the different populations are becoming increasingly outraged. So they have to, let's say, appease the people. So that's why the talk of recognizing Palestine on a piece of paper, which is useless, is now being discussed in some capitals in the West. It's basically to tell their own people, look, we're doing something about it. Whereas they're not really doing much. But it does show how bad things are for the Israeli regime. And when people across the world are seeing the Israeli regime as a genocidal regime that's carrying out a Holocaust, that is something that is more destructive than any other weapon, than any economic sanctions, than any um, you know uh, other economic or political or social pressure that can be put on the regime. For it to be seen as evil, I think is the ultimate defeat. So at that level, they've lost, and the starvation siege continues. And as you know, and as your audience knows, many of those who are starving, they will die, even if food gets in. But the plan is not to let food get in. They continue to target hospitals. They continue to carry out double tap attacks and then deny that it was intentional. And then it turns out that not only it wasn't a double tap attack, it was a triple attack, a tap attack. And now we hear that there were 4 strikes on the hospital. So when people see these, when people see the starvation, they become more sensitive. And then all of the atrocities being carried out by the Israeli regime, they become more visible because people are more outraged than before. The targeting of children, you see whistleblowers come like that former Green Beret um, uh, soldier. This is going downhill very fast. So the more the atrocities, the longer the atrocities continue, and the more starvation that we see, in my opinion, the Israeli regime is hurt more than even the Palestinians as a nation. Yes, the suffering is outrageous, but the Israeli regime is destroying itself in an irreversible manner. And people are now mobilizing. We see another flotilla on its way to Gaza with many more ships. And it's going to be far more difficult for the regime to stop them. And hopefully they'll be able to get through. Hopefully the tide is turning against the regime. But in any case, I see this as a huge defeat. In addition to that, in the recent attack operation that was carried out by the resistance in Gaza, we saw that Hamas was able to carry out a very sophisticated operation and inflict huge pain on the Israelis a couple of nights ago. That shows that their underground capabilities, their tunnel capabilities are growing, and that their equipment has been upgraded. So they're able to swiftly build their underground networks, prepare for operations. And as the Israeli regime tries to send in troops to occupy new territories, they're prepared for them. So this is not militarily, the Israelis are not winning the war. In the eyes of the world, they have lost uh, immensely because they're seen as genocidal. So every day that this war continues, I see it as worse for the Israeli regime. The Palestinian people are suffering enormously, and we have to do everything we can to force the regime to stop. But I don't see it stopping now because Trump is fully supporting the genocide. He's fully on board with, whether it's because of Epstein or it's because of his donors or because of both. That is a different question. But the situation is going to get a lot worse, I think, in the humanitarian sense for Palestinians. But in the eyes of the world, the Israelis, their image has been destroyed, and I think that destruction is irreversible. And Hamas has shown that it is more than capable on the ground, and nothing that the Israeli regime can do will change this. They will not be able to defeat Yemen. They can murder people, but Yemen has gone through 7 years of genocidal war supported by the West, where the Saudis and Emiratis were carrying out this war, and where Qatar and Turkey and regional countries were all supporting them until, of course, when the Emiratis and the Saudis turned against Qatar. Then they and the Turks tilted. But all these countries in the region, along with the West, were supporting this genocidal war against Yemen for 7 years. They failed. So the Israeli regime, by carrying out a few airstrikes, they're not going to achieve anything. They're only going to make Yemen more heroic in the eyes of the world, and Ansarullah as iconic in the eyes of people in this region and beyond. So the war against Hamas, the war against Ansarullah, the war against Iran, the war against Hezbollah. Right now, they're using Jolani and Al Qaeda and ISIS that have clearly revealed themselves as tools, along with the Americans and their allies in Lebanon and the Israelis to disarm the resistance in Lebanon. Everyone has been exposed, Glenn. Everyone. And that is important. Before, they were saying, they were speaking about, and many people were fooled through sectarianism, or even many on the left in the West. They went along with the CIA and the Western war against the Syrian people and the Syrian government. The people who opposed the war against Iraq, they supported the dirty war in Syria. Why? Because of Israel, Iran, and so they drank the Kool-Aid. They supported the CIA and Western intelligence agencies. And of course, Qatar and Turkey and Saudi Arabia used sectarianism to convince some people, and the West used human rights and all that nonsense to convince Westerners. But now, everything that the resistance said, that Seyed Hassan Nasrallah had said, is happening in Syria. They're balkanizing the country. They use ISIS and Al Qaeda, which are the most extreme and brutal terrorists, to push different minorities away. The Alawites are brutalized. The Druze are being pushed towards the Israeli regime, which they should not do. But in any case, that's happening. The Kurds, the Christians, everyone. That was the objective all along. That's why they used these extremists, because Israel wanted to balkanize Syria. And then the very same Al Qaeda people, the first thing they did when they came to power was they started trying to cut a deal with the Israelis. So now everyone has been exposed. But if the Israeli regime had won in Lebanon, then why is everyone working so hard to disarm the resistance? I think they failed on all counts. If they revive a war with Iran, it will bring about further failure. The more they try to strike Yemen, Yemen will strike back. And missiles flying over Tel Aviv is not a sign of strength for the Israeli regime. It will dissuade people from moving there, working there, but more importantly, they'll be forced to use their air defenses, depleting them further, but also giving Iran more information about their capabilities when the day comes. So on all fronts, the Israeli regime is losing. Western media would like to say that they're winning, but I think that they're losing at all levels. And ultimately, when this ends, the Israeli regime will be diminished. And alongside this, we have to take into account that the West is on the decline. The Israeli regime is a weak regime in itself. The only reason why it stays afloat is because of the massive aid given to it by the West. And the West, by the way, destroys its own image because of this. But as the West diminishes, the fortunes of the Israeli regime diminishes with it, alongside what I've explained before. And I think the symbolism of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit meeting that's going to be held shortly, the symbolism is something that will resonate under these circumstances.
I think you're correct in this analysis, how you're looking at not just the military, but the economic as well as the political and I guess soft power, the cultural attraction and the image someone has, because there is tremendous changes happening. I just fear often that this excessive focus on narrative control, it blinds people to see how the world is transforming ever more rapidly. So Professor Marandi, thank you as always. It's been very interesting.
Thank you very much for having me, Glenn. It's very kind of you.